The train station was a crush of bodies and noise, everyone moving fast but getting nowhere. Nina Walker stood near platform B, her feet screaming after a 12-hour waitressing shift. There was one empty seat on the long metal bench, and she claimed it with a silent groan of relief. Then she saw him. A man in a tailored coat, looking calm but standing like his bones were heavy. Not old, just weary in a way she understood deeply. Nina hesitated. The city punished softness. But this wasn't drama, it was simple, quiet need. She stood. "You can sit," she said, stepping away. He was surprised, but accepted with a quiet nod of thanks. They didn't speak. When the train arrived, he vanished into the crowd, and Nina forgot about him by the time she got home. She had rent due. Forgetting was a survival skill. She had no idea the man was billionaire Daniel Carter, or that her single, expectationless act had just rerouted both their lives. Welcome to a world where stories breathe. As you settle in, I wonder, where are you watching from tonight? By the glow of the Christmas tree, perhaps? If these tales find a home with you, consider subscribing. It's the most heartfelt gift a storyteller could receive this season. The station was a symphony of sighing brakes, scuffing souls, and the low, metallic hum of a system under strain. It was the weekday evening crush, a specific kind of urban exhaustion where too many people funneled through too few spaces, their collective weariness hanging in the air alongside the smell of damp concrete and ozone. Announcements crackled, half intelligible. The floor vibrated with the passing of expresses that didn't stop, each one a gust of displaced air and a reminder of motion elsewhere. Nina Walker felt the tremor through the soles of her shoes, a direct line to the ache in her feet. At 29, she had a precise, internal map of her own fatigue. She stood near platform B, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, a subtle, painful dance. The pain started in the balls of her feet, a hot pressure, then radiated up through her calves, settling into a dull, permanent throb in her lower back. 12 hours. A double at the Riverside Diner. 12 hours of carrying loaded trays, of standing still while refilling coffees, of navigating the narrow gap between vinyl booths with a fixed, polite smile. The kind of work that left you not just tired, but hollowed out. And there, against a grimy tile wall, was a sliver of salvation. One vacant spot on a long aluminum bench. It was between a teenager lost in headphones and an older man staring blankly at his phone. A minor miracle. Nina moved, her body a stiff argument against the motion, and lowered herself onto the cold, hard slat. The relief was immediate, almost violent. A breath escaped her, one she hadn't realized she'd been holding in her chest all day. That's when she saw him. He was standing maybe 10 feet away, facing the tracks. A man, maybe late 30s, in a coat that was too well made for this place, a deep charcoal wool, tailored, hinting at a world of quiet meetings and climate-controlled cars. But his posture betrayed the clothes. He wasn't leaning casually. One hand rested lightly on the back of the bench near the teenager, not for support, but as if testing its solidity. He stood perfectly still, a rock in the stream of commuters, but the stillness seemed like a concentrated effort. His face, in profile, was composed, but the light from the flickering overhead strip caught attention around his eyes. Not the end-of-day tiredness she saw in the mirror, but something deeper, a weariness of a different weight. Nina looked away. Her own rules were clear. Don't engage, don't invite, don't offer. The city taught you that. Softness got you drained, scammed, or worse. Her life was a ledger of necessities, rent, utilities, the ever-rising cost of a loaf of bread. There was no column for charity. She focused on the black tunnel mouth, waiting for the twin headlights of her train. But her eyes drifted back. It was the hand, the barely there touch on the bench. It was the way he drew a slow breath, held it, let it out with a control that seemed to cost him. This wasn't a performance. There was no audience here, just 200 people deliberately not seeing each other. He wasn't asking. He was just enduring. The war inside her was short and brutal. On one side, the fiery protest in her feet, the knowledge that this seat was her only respite before the long walk home, the simple animal need to rest. On the other, a quiet, inconvenient recognition. She knew need. She wore it every day. Without drama, without a sigh of martyrdom, She pushed herself up. The pain flared anew, a sharp complaint. She took 2 steps toward a grimy support column. "You can sit," she said, her voice barely carrying over the station's din. He turned his head. His eyes, a tired gray, focused on her, then flicked to the vacated spot. He looked surprised, as if he'd forgotten he was visible. "Oh. No, I'm fine. Thank you." "You don't look fine," Nina said, not unkindly. It was a simple observation. "I'll be all right." It was a lie. She wouldn't be. But the words were out. He studied her for a second, not her face, but the act itself, as if deciphering it. Then, a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you." He didn't collapse into the seat. He lowered himself with a careful, deliberate motion, as if respecting the space she'd given. He didn't look at her again. Nina leaned against the column, crossing her arms, becoming part of the station's scenery once more. No more words passed between them. When the southbound train clattered into the station, he stood, collected himself, and as he moved toward the opening doors, his gaze found hers for a split second. Another nod, this one different, acknowledging a shared, silent transaction. Then he was absorbed into the shifting mass of bodies. Nina boarded the next train a minute later. She found a strap to hold, closed her eyes as the carriage jerked into motion, and let the incident dissolve. She didn't wonder who he was or what his burden might be. Her mind was already scrolling through a more pressing calculus. The rent was due in 4 days, and her tips had been light. The man in the good coat faded, a ghost in the clutter of her survival. By the time she keyed into her quiet, dim apartment, he was gone, forgotten. Life demanded you forget the small mercies you gave, or the weight of them would break you. The train moved on. The station emptied and filled. Nothing had changed. Nina Walker had been a waitress for a decade. It wasn't a career she'd chosen. It was the ground that had risen to meet her when everything else fell away. Her father was a memory with a fading face. Her mother worked 2 jobs until her lungs, weakened by years in a textile mill, made one impossible. College lasted a semester and a half before the numbers in Nina's bank account screamed louder than any professor. The world of potential shrank to the 4 walls of the Riverside Diner, with its cracked linoleum and the perpetual smell of old grease and bleach. Her education became reading the subtle language of need, the customer tracing the menu with a trembling finger who couldn't afford much, the flushed family trying to quiet a fussy child, the lonely regular who just wanted 5 minutes of chatter with their pie. She learned to armor herself in pleasant, professional distance. Kindness was a finite resource, and hers was budgeted for survival. 3 days after the station, he walked into the diner. Nina was refilling a pyramid of sugar dispensers, her back to the door when the bell chimed. She turned, rag in hand, and there he was. The same man. Same coat, now hung neatly on a hook by the booth. He sat in her section, in the corner booth by the window that looked out onto the alley and the dumpsters. Their eyes met. A flicker of recognition, clear and mutual, passed between them in the quiet afternoon lull. No smile, just acknowledgement. "You gave me your seat," he said. His voice was quieter here, less strained than on the platform. "Yeah," Nina replied, walking over with a menu she already knew he wouldn't need. "Guess I did." "Thank you," he said again. The words held more space here, away from the station's chaos. They felt heavier. She took his order, black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast. He ate methodically, without enjoyment, watching the gray light in the alley. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't ask her name. He simply existed in her space, treating her with a neutral, undemanding courtesy that felt, ironically, more respectful than the forced friendliness of other customers. When he paid, he left a tip that was generous but not ostentatious, folded neatly under the check presenter. He paused as she cleared his plate. "I hope your night's easier tonight," he said. Nina let out a soft, genuine laugh, surprised by it. "That's ambitious." A ghost of something, not quite a smile, touched his lips. Then he was gone. He came back the next day. Same time. Same booth. Coffee, eggs, toast. And the day after that. He became a fixture, a quiet punctuation mark in her afternoon shift. His name, she learned from his credit card slip, was Daniel Carter. He was consistently, profoundly polite. He never complained. He always met her eyes. He said please and thank you as if they were words with meaning. In the ecosystem of the diner, where she was either invisible or a target for frustrations, his simple humanity was disarming. She sensed a solitude in him that mirrored her own, though its texture was foreign. His seemed chosen, hers had been imposed. Daniel Carter had left the cardiologist's office that evening at the station with a piece of paper that read mild arrhythmia and a cold, clarifying fear. It wasn't fatal. It was, the doctor assured, manageable with stress reduction. The problem was Daniel had built a life, an empire of logistics spanning continents, where stress wasn't a factor to be reduced, it was the atmosphere. He was 38. He was worth just over $11 billion. He was called unflappable and austere in business journals. No one knew about the tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with stock prices. On that crowded platform, feeling the unfamiliar, disconcerting flutter under his ribs, he had been utterly alone. The world saw a man in a Bryony coat. He felt like a boy afraid of the dark. Then a woman with exhaustion etched into her own posture had stood up. For him. She had looked at him and seen not power, not wealth, but a human being who needed to sit down. The absence of any calculation in her act, the pure, costly grace of it, had been a light in a very private tunnel. Watching her work at the riverside was a study in graceful endurance. He saw how she managed difficult customers with a firm calm, how she remembered the old man's soup came with extra crackers without being asked, how her shoulders sagged by the end of her shift. He overheard her talking to the cook about a rent increase. The numbers were small to him. The terror in her controlled voice was not. Daniel's mind worked in systems and solutions. He identified bottlenecks and eliminated them. He saw a problem, a good person being crushed by a mundane, fixable weight, and his instinct was to apply leverage. To him, money was a tool, the most efficient one he possessed. It could clear obstacles, silence alarms, build bridges. It was how he cared for people from a distance. Anonymous donations, funded programs, strategic philanthropy. He decided to help. It was not a dramatic decision, but a logical one. He would remove the immediate pressure. It was what he did. Sitting in his stark, silent office high above the city, Daniel drafted an instruction to his assistant. A payment, to be made anonymously, covering 6 months of rent for a Nina Walker at her apartment building. No traceback. No expectation. A clean, surgical fix. He leaned back, the tightness in his chest easing. The problem would be solved. He had done a good thing. Down in the diner, Nina wiped down Daniel's empty booth, unaware that the universe, in the form of a billionaire used to moving worlds, had just shifted beneath her feet. She felt only the familiar ache in her wrists and the simple satisfaction of a quiet customer who treated her like a person. The true weight of his gratitude was still in the mail, speeding toward her, a solution she had never asked for, to a problem she had never presented to him. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a plain, business-sized envelope mixed with grocery store flyers. Nina opened it standing at her kitchen counter, a bowl of cereal forgotten beside her. It was a statement from her property management company, but it made no sense. The balance due was 0. A note, printed on a separate slip, read, "Prepayment received for 6 months' rent. No further action required." She read it 3 times. The numbers swam. 6 months. A sum that represented countless double shifts, skipped meals, and nights of low-grade panic. It was freedom. It was air. Then, the cold wave hit, washing away the initial shock of relief. Prepayment received. Not from her. Anonymous. Her hands began to shake. The paper whispered against her fingers. She didn't think of lottery wins or mysterious benefactors. In the stark economy of her life, there was only one new variable. One person whose presence had coincided with a change in her fortunes. Daniel Carter. The anger was immediate, hot, and clarifying. It wasn't the anger of ingratitude, but of violation. He had looked at her life, diagnosed it as a problem, and prescribed a solution without consulting the patient. He had turned her quiet struggle into a line item on his charitable balance sheet. The kindness on the platform, a moment she'd owned, a choice she'd made, had been retrofitted with a price tag. Her dignity, which she'd maintained through sheer force of will in that diner, felt cheapened, recategorized as a symptom of need. She folded the letter precisely, her movements sharp. The cereal turned soggy in the bowl. She went to work, the paper a burning weight in her apron pocket. He came in at his usual time. Nina watched him hang his coat, settle into his booth, and look out the window at the alley with that same detached calm. She waited. She finished an order, delivered a check, poured coffees with steady hands. Then she walked to his table, empty-handed. She placed the folded letter on the formica between them. "Did you do this?" Daniel looked from the paper to her face. Her expression was not the polite, professional mask he was used to. It was stripped bare, all hard lines and wounded pride. He saw no point in evasion. "I thought it would help." "You didn't ask," she said, her voice low and tight, carrying only between them in the diner's hum. "I didn't want to put you in an uncomfortable position." "You already did." The words were flat, final. "I didn't give you my seat so you could save me." "I wasn't trying to," he began, the boardroom defense rising automatically. "You were," she interrupted, her gaze nailing him to the spot. "You saw something broken and decided to fix it. That might work with a supply chain. It doesn't work with people." She leaned forward slightly, not invading his space, but making hers unignorable. "You assumed my life was a problem you could solve with a transaction. That my pride was less important than my rent." Daniel felt the words land not as criticism, but as a fundamental miscalculation. He had faced down hostile takeovers and vindictive regulators, but this quiet, fierce accuracy from a waitress in a diner dismantled him. His money, his primary tool of agency, had just been revealed as an instrument of profound disrespect. He had intended to lift a weight and instead had implied she was too weak to carry it. The humiliation was not hers. It was his, for having been so blind. "I'm not a charity case," Nina continued, the heat leaving her voice, replaced by a weary steel. "I'm just tired sometimes. Like everyone else. But I pay my own way." Silence expanded in the booth, swallowing the clatter of dishes. He had no data for this, no contingency plan. The solution had become the problem. "I'm sorry," he said. The apology was raw, unadorned by explanation or justification. It was simply true. She studied him, seeing for the first time not the billionaire or the regular, but a man who had just realized the limits of his own world. The anger bled away, leaving a strange, shared emptiness. "The money stays," she said finally, the decision firm. "Because I need it, and because you owe me that much for the insult. But don't you ever do anything like that again. Don't try to fix me." He nodded, a sharp, accepting motion. "Understood." Nina picked up the letter, tucked it back into her apron, and walked away to attend to another table. The conversation was over. Daniel sat for a long moment, then signaled for the check. He paid, left no tip, understanding now it would be misread, and walked out. The automare was brisk. For the first time in over a decade, he had entered a situation intending to exert control and had left with none. The tightness in his chest returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the fear of a malfunctioning heart. It was the ache of a lesson learned too late. He had confused help with control, and in doing so, had almost extinguished the very decency he'd sought to reward. He saw now that true help wasn't something you imposed, it was something you had to be invited to give. The path forward, if there was one, was no longer his to chart alone. Inside, Nina cleared his untouched water glass. Her hands were steady. She felt curiously light. She had stood her ground not against a billionaire, but against her idea, that her struggle diminished her, that her consent was optional. She had her rent paid, but she had reclaimed something far more valuable, her own narrative. The balance of power between them had irrevocably shifted. He had seen her need. Now, she had forced him to see her. The second letter arrived a week later. Nina's fingers hesitated before tearing it open, a fresh coil of apprehension in her stomach. But this envelope was different, thicker, with a corporate logo embossed in the corner, Carter Logistics. Inside was no check, no statement. It was a brochure and a cover letter. Carter Logistics Hospitality and Operations Management Development Program, the title read. A fully-paid, 6-month training initiative with a living wage stipend, designed for experienced service industry professionals seeking to transition into leadership, training, or logistics roles. The curriculum was detailed: inventory management, HR fundamentals, client relations, operational efficiency. It was rigorous. It required commitment. The final line of the cover letter stood out: admission is based solely on merit and interview. This is not a gift. It is an opportunity to work. Nina sat at her kitchen table, the hum of her refrigerator the only sound. This was not a solution dropped in her lap. It was a door, and the handle was on her side. He hadn't fixed her. He'd seen her and built a bridge to a place she couldn't reach on her own. The respect in that gesture was palpable. It acknowledged her capacity, not just her need. She applied. She spent nights after shifts studying sample questions, rehearsing answers to the wall of her studio apartment. The interview was held in a modest Carter Logistics satellite office, not the towering headquarters. The panel asked about customer conflicts, about streamlining a chaotic shift, about training new hires. They asked about resilience. Nina spoke from a decade of lived data. She got the acceptance email 3 days later. The program was the hardest work she'd ever done. It was mental, not physical, a marathon of spreadsheets, case studies, and leadership theories that felt abstract until she mapped them onto the reality of the Riverside Diner. Daniel was absent. He was a signature on the program's founding documents, a distant patron, but he never visited, never made his presence known. She understood. This was a proving ground, and his shadow would have skewed the light. She graduated top of her cohort. A job offer followed, not from him, but from the program's director, to help run and eventually expand the initiative for other restaurant groups. She would be designing the ladders she'd once needed. For Daniel, the program was an act of applied learning. The confrontation in the diner had been a seismic event in his insulated world. He had reevaluated every anonymous donation, every top-down philanthropic initiative. He saw the difference between giving someone a fish, teaching them to fish, and, most importantly, recognizing they were already a skilled fisher trapped in a pond without outlets. His new approach was to build the channels. He learned restraint. He did not check on Nina's progress, though the monthly reports on the program's first cohort sat on his desk, her name consistently highlighted. His satisfaction was quiet, rooted in the integrity of the structure, not in her specific outcome. He learned that partnership meant providing resources and then getting out of the way, allowing dignity to do the work. Leadership, he saw, wasn't about carrying people. It was about making sure the path was clear for them to walk on their own strength. 2 years later, Nina's feet still ached at the end of the day, but the ache had a different quality. It was the fatigue of purpose, not depletion. She stood in a conference room in a smart blazer, pointing to a flowchart on a screen, training managers from a chain of boutique hotels. You identify the natural problem solvers on your staff, she said, her voice confident, clear. You give them the language for the skills they already have. She still worked long hours, but they were hours that stacked into something, a career, a future, a legacy of opening doors. One evening, delayed by a meeting, she found herself on the same train platform, Platform B. The scene was unchanged, the same weary crowd, the same sighing trains. She stood comfortably, a leather bag at her feet, waiting. Across the platform, she saw him. Daniel Carter, alone, hands in the pockets of a simpler coat. He was watching a scene unfold near the benches. A young woman in nurse's scrubs, looking utterly spent, had just risen from the last seat and was gesturing to an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane. The old man protested weakly, but the nurse smiled, shook her head, and insisted. He sat with a grateful sigh. The nurse leaned against a pillar, closed her eyes, and breathed. No one else seemed to notice. No cameras, no applause. Just a small, costly kindness, freely given. Daniel's gaze lifted from the scene and found Nina's across the tracks. They looked at each other. No wave. No smile. No acknowledgement was needed. The moment was its own testament. Nina's train arrived first. She boarded, found a seat, and looked out the window as the platform began to move. She saw Daniel still standing there, a calm figure in the streaming crowd, before the tunnel swallowed the view. The train carried her forward, into the dark and out again, toward home. On the platform behind her, and on countless others, in diners and offices and quiet streets, kindness continued its work. It didn't announce itself. It asked for no credit. It simply moved, from one person to the next, a quiet, enduring current in the rush of the world. Thank you for sharing this story with me. As the Christmas lights twinkle, remember, your subscription isn't just a click. It's a bell that rings out, telling me to keep writing for you. Don't let the magic end here. Subscribe, and let's journey into the new year together.